Hey Unity audio folks! Today we're going to be going over FMOD parameters for Unity. We're going to be talking about both local parameters as well as global parameters. Global parameters are new with Unity or with FMOD 2.0, and they're super useful for certain things, although they're not useful across the board because if you have a lot of instance objects or instance copies of different objects and you need them to have different parameters at any one time, they're pretty much unusable for that. But we'll be going into a quick twin stick shooter example that I built this week and break down a couple of the sound effects that I'm using global parameters on versus local parameters. So in our FMOD project here, you'll notice we have a new tab relative to last week. In it, we've got the parameter scene, which we're going to be working with. That's our twin stick shooter scene. We've got a few events. We've got an enemy hit event, enemy killed, enemy spawned, power up collected, power up spawned, and a shoot event. And if you're paying really close attention, you'll notice some of these have parameters. For instance, the shoot event has two separate sounds. Each of these represent a different weapon, and they're tied to this power-up type parameter. If I open this up, we'll notice it's a discrete parameter, and it's global. Our power-up collected also uses the same power-up type sound effect, and that's because we only have one player object in our scene, and that player is only ever going to have one weapon, so I can kind of dictate everything tied to the type of weapon the player currently has, which includes both the power-up sound that's being played as well as the shot of the weapon itself, from one single parameter. So for this, we're going to be using a global parameter. For enemy spawned, we have this enemy size parameter. We're also using that for enemy killed and enemy hit, but all that this is doing is driving a pitch bend on each of these depending on the size of the enemy. It's a super simple example, but I think it serves really well to kind of illustrate the point of how to get parameters up and working pretty quick. So moving over into FMOD, the first thing we're going to want to do is check to make sure that we have our audio banks set up in our audio manager here. And it looks like we do. We've got our parameter bank set, which is the bank that we're using for this scene. And secondly, that we have an FMOD Studio listener on our main camera. So with that, let's take a look at what we have. So for this demo, I have set up a simple character controller on a little 2D object. If I hold down the left mouse button, I'll fire shots. I can run over the green things to collect essentially power-ups. And now there's a chance that I'll roll a different weapon. It's determined by chance though, so it won't always change. And then periodically I'll be spawning these kind of enemy targets of varying sizes. If I hit them enough times, they'll break. The smaller they are, the fewer times I'll have to hit them. So the first sounds that we're going to hook up are these enemy sound effects. So for those, we're going to go into our prefabs folder, and I've created an enemy prefab. And the events we're going to be dealing with are the enemy being hit, the enemy being killed, and the enemy spawning in. Now, all three of these events are tied to the enemy's current health, or can be. The enemy spawning in doesn't necessarily have to be, but for shorthand, we're going to go ahead and do that. So the first thing that we're going to do is add our using statement for FMOD Unity, because there are a number of things we're going to be using that require this tag, and it's nice to kind of shorthand some of our code with it. And the next thing we're going to do is create some serialized fields for our different events. So you'll notice that I've made this field private, and I'm using the serialized field tag instead. This behaves similarly to a public function. It'll show up in the inspector. And I've also included this event_ref tag, which indicates that the type of string that we're using is in fact an FMOD string specifically. So it gives us this searchable field to find our events in. So we're going to go ahead and put our hit event in, as well as our other two events. So now with everything in place, the next thing that we're going to want to do is test one of these events to make sure it's working. So to do that, I'm going to go down to this if statement here. If we pass this if statement here, it means that our target collider has intercepted one of our player's projectiles, and we want to play our hit sound effect if that is true. So the first thing we'll do is we'll make sure that we have assigned our hit sound effect. And then we'll simply play the hit sound effect as a one-shot. And we'll play that one shot at the position of our target. So the sound will play where the target is when the target's hit. Now, if we press play, you'll hear that our hit sound is indeed working as intended. So our next step is to take that hit sound and apply our parameter to the sound itself. And in order to do that, we cannot use the play one shot kind of shorthand. So the first thing we'll do is we'll convert that play one shot shorthand to basically the exact code that is inside of play one shot, and then add our parameter values to that code. So these 3 lines of code here are the exact same functionally as a 2D position-free play one-shot. However, we also need to capture this position that we applied to this one-shot. So for that, we will take our sound instance here, our event instance, which is the kind of like container that is going to play the sound. It's the event. And we'll set a position for it. So what this code is doing is we're taking the instance, as we said, and we're calling set 3D attributes on that, which requires a 3D attributes type. It's a custom FMOD type. So we're using the runtime utilities to convert our transform to an FMOD compatible position value. And now all we have left to do is set the parameter. So for that, it'll be pretty similar to this set 3D attributes call, except instead we will use the command set parameter by name. We could choose to set it by ID instead. It's a little more efficient if you cache the ID somewhere and then recall that over and over. But for simplicity, in this case, we're just going to call it by the string name of the parameter itself. And in this case, our parameter's name is enemy size with no spaces. And what we'll scale it off of is the scale of the target object itself. And we'll be paying close attention to the X value in particular. It could have been any of them in this case because we're transforming them all equally, but we'll be tracking the X value. And really quickly, going over to our enemy spawner, which is what's spawning the enemy objects. The reason we are tracking one of the scale values for the parameter is because we are scaling our size of our targets from 0.25 over here to 4. And we're deciding what the size of each of the coordinates are based on that. Also based on this random range here. Our parameter within FMOD itself scales from 0 to 4. So we've got a little extra room to kind of mess with there. It's not really necessary that we do that. It's more just for simplicity. So now with these 5 lines of code here, we have an instance of the sound that's being created from the event reference. We are setting the position of the sound. We're setting the parameter to the size of the object it's on, or based on the size of the object it's on. We're starting playback of the sound on the sound instance, and then we are releasing the sound instance. And this is super important. If you don't release your manually created event instances, at some point, they will cause a memory leak over time. And the way to check for this is by using the FMOD profiler and recording for a while as multiple sounds play through, and you'll start seeing a bunch of instances that exist without sounds tied to them. So going into the game now and testing, you'll hear that the larger targets have a lower pitched sound than the smaller targets. Now we're going to repeat this process with our other 2 sounds, the killed sound effect and the spawn sound effect. But instead of just running through this whole process again, because the parameter that we're working with is the same and the way that we're positioning the sounds is the same, we can actually reuse all this code. So in order to do that, we're going to create a function call and basically place all of this code here within that function. So all that we're doing here is we are calling this play enemy sound effects function that we just wrote and passing in the event instance string up here, or any of the other event instance strings, and then running through all of that code that we just created but this time with generic names, all based around the sound effect that we pass in. This provides some additional flexibility because we have this null check, such that if you had multiple different objects with a health script, you could decide to just not assign sound effects to some of them, and the code would still run as intended. It would work with different sounds on different objects, etc. So to finish off our enemy sound effects, we're going to need to add in the spawn sound, and we can just place that on start. And the killed sound effect can go in this check to see on collision if our health has been reduced to 0. And in this case, it probably doesn't matter, but it should, just for safety, be before our destroy call. Now with that, let's test again. And we have both spawn sounds as well as the killed sounds working on top of our pre-existing hit sounds. So informationally, we also would like a sound on our power-ups as they spawn in. So for that, all we have to do is go to our power-up prefab. And in this case, because we don't have a parameter hooked up for our power-up, we can just use the kind of default FMOD emitter component. We'll start the playback of the sound on object start, and we're not actually going to have a stop call in this case because our sound is not looping, and so it will be automatically cleaned up once it's played its one shot. And in the event that a power-up was to spawn on or really close to our player, we don't want the sound to get cut off before it's played all the way through to kind of help solidify the information that a player has actually picked up a power-up if it did happen to spawn right under their feet. As a note, if we did want to have a parameter for the initial value of an FMOD Studio event, we could open this initial parameter value triangle here, and there would be a drop-down here if we had any parameters assigned to it of the parameter itself and the values that we could set it to. Now to test this, we're going to go ahead and turn our spawn interval way up. And as you can hear, we now have our spawn sound working. I'll turn that back down. So the final two sounds we have to hook up are the sound of our player picking up a power-up and the sound of our player's weapons firing. Fortunately, both of those things are done on the player object, but in this case, it wouldn't matter if they weren't because we're controlling both of those with global parameters, and we could set the values of our global parameters anywhere in our project and have the logic for the things they're tied to be completely unattached, and they would still respond to the parameter changes. So to start, we're going to open up our player prefab and go into our player controller. So the first place we're going to look to in our player controller is this fire function. And in the fire function, we're first checking to see if our fire button is pressed, in this case our mouse 1, and next to see if enough time has passed since our previous shot such that we can fire another shot. And finally, we have the checks to see which projectile we're currently firing. This is kind of a hack fix because I'm only using 2 weapons just for the sake of the prototype. But if we wanted more, we could make this a more general function. But for now, this is where we're going to be applying our shot sound effect because the parameter will be controlling the different sound that's played and not the same logic that's controlling how the projectiles are spawned. Down here in apply power up is where we will be triggering our power-up pickup sound. Specifically, we will be triggering it after the projectile type has been chosen. In this case, that's after this random range roll has completed. We could put it at the end of the function as well, but we'll put it right here for now. So to start, we're going to do the same thing we did before and create serialized fields to place the FMOD events into. And unlike for local parameters, for global parameters, we can use the play one shot function and still apply parameter values to it. because global parameters check a global value that's kind of outside the context of the event instance to see what value they're setting their relevant parameters to. So that simplifies our code quite a bit. And in this case, we're just going to do an if check and then play a one shot for each of our different sound events. And in this case, unlike with the previous one shots, we do not need to set the position for these sounds to play because I've made the design decision to make them both 2D events because they're always going to be triggering on the player itself. So now we have to assign the events, test to see if they work, and if everything's working as intended, we can move on to setting global parameters. And it seems I've accidentally misassigned one of these. But fortunately, they did both seem to be working. So the next step that we're going to do is create a field for our parameter. And as I said before, you could put this field anywhere that you have access to the values that you want to set the parameter to. In this case, we will be setting the parameter within our player controller because we also happen to have the values here. But the first thing is, just like with events, we want to create a field for our global parameter. Unlike events, however, for global parameters, we can use the paramref tag, unlike local parameters as well. Now if I save, you'll notice this field here, but if I search, our parameter does not show up here. And the reason for that is because there's currently an FMOD bug in place that does not allow you to use discrete parameters for global events. So jumping back into FMOD, if I look at our power-up type parameter here, it's currently a discrete parameter. A labeled parameter is just a discrete parameter, but you can apply specific names to it. But for now, we're going to have to use a continuous parameter instead. So a discrete parameter locks you to integer values for what you set the parameter to, and it can be really nice for creating different variations that you want to trigger based on where a parameter is. A continuous parameter, however, does not have the same functionality. Instead, it lets you kind of move anywhere across a range of numbers, and in some ways acts more like a blend container from Wise or something of that nature, where you can kind of blend between or crossfade between different values over time. For instance, we're doing this in our enemy sound effects, depending on the enemy size. So we don't have set values assigned. Say like the small sound effect plays from 0 to 1, although we could do that, and the medium from 1 to 2, and the large from 2 to 4. But in this case, we're blending the pitch based on the size directly. However, in this case, we can make our continuous parameter behave like a discrete parameter simply by having the sounds that we want to play be the only things that are present at the specific values that we want. And if you notice that I just bumped these over a little bit, that was just to make sure that if we were at 1, if we were exactly at 1, it wouldn't accidentally play sounds from either side of these pairs of sounds. Now with those changes in place, you'll notice that our power-up type does show up in the weapon types parameter field. So we'll select that. And now, before our sound is played, in apply power-up type, we're going to set our parameter to the projectile that we end up rolling with our random range value. So to set a global parameter, all we need to do is kind of similar to setting a local parameter. Access the runtime manager. This time use Studio System and set parameter by name. Our name is equal to our global parameter field string. And again, we could cache this as well. And in this case, the value we want to set it to is this current projectile value, which is equal to a random integer between or including 0 and the projectile length array that we have, which in this case holds 2 elements. In Unity, random range, if you're using floats, will include the highest number, but if you're using integers, it'll exclude it. So in this case, the highest number would be 2, which means our random range would be from 0, would either be 0 or 1. If this was a float, it would be any value between 0 and 2, including either of the extremes. Now with that set, we're again going to increase our spawn interval and test our sounds. And it seems like everything is working. And that pretty much concludes my walkthrough of the basics of how to use both local and global parameters for FMOD Unity. Next week, we're going to be taking probably the same project and adding some rhythmic events to it and walking through a really simple kind of rhythmic triggering or event callback system based approach. In other words, super basic beat mapping. If you have any additional questions about this tutorial or any of my other ones, please feel free to reach out to me on social media, and I'd be happy to get back to you about those if I can. And if it's applicable, some of those questions might end up making it in as the prompts to future videos. So with that, hope you're all having a great week, and I'll see you all next time.